حياكم الله جميعا في لقائنا اليوم. لقاء اليوم راح يكون عن التحليل الاقتصادي في مصانع البتروكيماويات او الكوست اناليسيس ان بتروكيميكال اندستري. ومعنا اليوم الدكتور حسن بعقيل. دكتور حسن استاذ مساعد في قسم الهندسة الكيميائية. حياك الله دكتور حسن.
الله يحييك.
وحياكم الله ايضا يا شباب. ان شاء الله في نهاية اللقاء راح يكون فيه فقرة أسئلة. تفضل يا دكتور.
طيب، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أشكر النادي على هذه الدعوة الكريمة. بإذن الله إن شاء الله تكون يعني لقاء موفق بإذن الله ومفيد للجميع. طبعا راح أحاول أحاضر باللغة الإنجليزية حتى تكون المصطلحات هي نفس المصطلحات اللي راح تسمعها إن شاء الله بعد التخرج والانتقال إلى سوق العمل. لكن إذا وجدت ترجمة فورية لبعض هذه المصطلحات راح إن شاء الله أستخدمها. أنا تم التواصل معي قبل تقريبا أسبوعين أو 3 بخصوص المحاضرة هذه أو السيمينار، وكانت في الأساس مركزة فقط على الجانب الاقتصادي، لكن أحببت أن يكون فيها جانب آخر، وزي ما يقولون نحاول نضرب عصفورين بحجر بهذه المحاضرة، بحيث أن يستفيد الطالب في المبادئ الاقتصادية أولاً، وبعد ذلك يستفيد أيضاً بتطبيقات هذه المبادئ الاقتصادية على قطاع مهم في المملكة العربية السعودية، وهو قطاع البتروكيماويات. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. We will cover the economic concepts review from applied to petrochemical industry. The purpose or the objective of this presentation is to introduce you to important economic concepts and also introduce you to the petrochemical industry. And finally, which is actually the more important or the most important goal, is to show you how some of the concepts that you learn in textbooks are very challenging when you apply it to real markets. Show of hands if you've taken any economic course. Let's see if we have any people with some background. And I'm trying to find out who's raising his hand. I see 3 people, only 3 people. All right, so if I have only 3 people, that's good news to me. I won't get challenged. So, but hopefully I will get many questions at the end of the lecture. Before I start, I would like to quote Elon Musk in a very intriguing quotation or quote on engineering. He says, engineering is the closest thing to magic that exists in the world. ببساطة, it's a statement that a scientist is saying about engineering. Think about that. A scientist, Elon Musk, يعتبر physicist, he's talking about engineering. ويمدح الengineering, it's the closest thing to magic. And the reason, in my opinion, is that engineering takes science, economics, and practical tricks and design hacks to make things work. And that's why Elon Musk is saying that engineering is almost magical. So the second element into making engineering work is to focus on economics. All right, our agenda today is to cover the petrochemical industry overview and then cover some important economic concepts. I have 10 economic concepts that I will try to cover, hopefully. How much time we have, Majid?
ان شاء الله ساعه لساعه ونص.
I need, inshallah, less. I need about 40 minutes to cover the slides, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So these economic concepts include a value chain, operating rates, cost structure, fixed and variable cost, amortization of equipment, crack spread, working capital and working capital interest charges, supply and demand curves, price equilibrium, supply-demand dynamics, which include forecast, rationalization, and trade flows. Now, this might be overwhelming, but these concepts are simple concepts that everyone, including those who are going to become engineers, who are in their orientation or in their first year in their degree, I think they should understand these concepts with no problem. In fact, some of these concepts are covered in an AP exam. I was astonished talking to some high school students back in the US, and I've discovered that some of these concepts are covered during high school in some of the high school programs. So let's take them one by one after we take the overview of the petrochemical industry. So the petrochemical industry is a chemical conversion process, or a chemical conversion industry of four important feedstocks. The first one is crude oil. The second one is natural gas. The third one is coal. And the fourth one is bio-based organic material. بمعنى, if you have a petrochemical plant, راح تجد أحد الأربعة اللي أمامك راح تشوفهم as a feedstock to your plant. راح يكون إما crude oil or natural gas or coal or biomaterial. Before we can process crude oil and convert it using the chemical conversion processes in petrochemicals, we have to do some separation for the crude oil. And this is a typical distillation column or distillation unit of a crude oil. The most important feedstock to the petrochemical industry is called naphtha. Naphtha is an important feedstock to the petrochemical industry, and it used to be the primary feedstock to create petrochemical products. In distillation columns in general, for those who doesn't know what is a distillation column, a distillation column separates compounds or components of your feed based on their boiling points. So crude oil consists of thousands of compounds, of chemical compounds, and their boiling points have a huge range. Those that has a boiling point between 185 and 350 Fahrenheit typically are separated, and the stream is called naphtha. Naphtha is typically not used for fuel. It's used as a feedstock, لقيم, petrochemical. Recently, there has been a switch in the petrochemical industry from naphtha feedstock to ethane feedstock to natural gas feedstock. The reason is ethane is becoming abundant in many countries, and it's cheaper to produce ethane than producing naphtha. So ethane price is locally decided. Why is the price of ethane locally decided? Because natural gas is very expensive to transport across borders. So the only use, or most of the use, of natural gas has to be within the country, going within Saudi Arabia, within the nearby countries. So if we have abundance of ethane, we have to utilize it, and that utilization is typically in the form of a feedstock to the petrochemical plants. A good important example is in the US. في أمريكا تقريبا عندما كنت أدرس في أمريكا، هذا الكلام تقريبا في نهاية القرن السابق، يعني 1900 تقريبا و99 و 98، كانت أسعار الغاز مرتفعة جدا في أمريكا، والسبب قلة الغاز اللي موجود في أمريكا. طبعا في بداية الألفية اللي حصل إنه تم اكتشاف تقنية جديدة للحفر. هذه التقنية الجديدة يعني بس استطاعت أن تستخرج كمية كبيرة من الغاز الترابت، خلينا نقول، أو المحصور بين الصخور. Okay, and that gas is called shale gas أو الغاز الصخري. الغاز الصخري سبب ثورة في الغاز في أمريكا وفي كثير من الدول، فأصبح سعر الغاز رخيص جدا مقارنة بسعر البترول، ولذلك تحولت صناعة البتروكيماويات من النافثة كلقيم إلى الإيثين كلقيم. طيب الناتشورال غاز يحوي على ميثين، إيثين، بروبين، بيوتين and other compounds. الميثين يستخدم primarily كفيول غاز، وممكن يستخدم لاستخراج أيضا لصناعة الميثانول وصناعة الأمونيا. الإيثين is used as a petrochemical feedstock, while the propane and the butane forms the LPG that we know that's used as a fuel. We take the ethane and create the building blocks of the petrochemical industry. Primarily, the building blocks of the petrochemical industry is either olefins and, olefins and aromatics. Olefins are primarily ethylene, propylene, and butadiene. In the aromatics, we have benzene, toluene, and hexidine. These are the building blocks for many other petrochemical products that you can create down the value chain. This is a quick overview of the building blocks and the initial stages for the chemical conversion in the petrochemical industry. We will not dig deeper because this is not a presentation on petrochemicals, but I wanted to give you an overview of the petrochemicals before we talk about the economics of the petrochemicals. So the first concept that we want to cover is value chain analysis. What do we mean by value chain analysis? Value chain analysis, it's a process of analyzing the steps that involve bringing a product to market. يعني ببساطة هي مراقبة القيمة المضافة لكل عملية في عملية إنتاج المنتج النهائي، وملاحظة التكاليف وكيف إمكانية رفع الكفاءة. So the purpose is increasing production efficiency so the company can deliver maximum value for the least possible cost. So let's say we are producing polyethylene. Polyethylene production goes through a number of steps, from the feedstock up to the final product. The value chain analysis in economics and all businesses is the process of looking at each step and evaluating what value they add, how I reduce the cost, increase efficiency, or maybe get rid of the whole process completely. And this is actually a process that we will cover later that is called rationalization. We'll talk about it later. So what is the value chain of ethylene as a raw material? Well, ethylene can produce ethylene oxide and then produce ethylene glycol. And from ethylene glycol, I can produce polyester. I can also take ethylene and produce ethylene dichloride and then produce vinyl chloride monomer and then produce a polyvinyl chloride, which is called PVC. We all know PVC because PVC is used in making pipes in our homes and everywhere else. Now, if you do value chain analysis, if you produce polyester, then you will evaluate exactly whether producing polyester makes sense or should you stop in producing ethylene glycol. If you think that polyester does not add value, you would, as a result of value chain analysis, decide that I need to stop by producing ethylene glycol and selling ethylene glycol instead of selling polyester. All right, the second term, economic term I want to cover is operating rates. Operating rates is not very commonly used in other industries other than some petrochemical industry, but typically is known as utilization factor. كثير من الصناعات الأخرى تستخدم مصطلح آخر يسمى utilization factor. So operating rates means how much surplus do I have in my plant to produce compared to my existing operating level. بمعنى, when we design a plant, we design it for a specific design capacity or specific production capacity. After we operate the plant, we typically operate lower than the production capacity. So the operating rates compares the production capacity with the operating capacity. The following, the graph here, shows the utilization, the actual utilization percentage for the petrochemical manufacturers. As you can see in the graph, in the blue bars, you have nameplate capacity. Nameplate capacity is the design capacity when you build the plant. Available capacity is the capacity of the plant now given the deterioration of the capacity of the plant or the improvement of the capacity of the plant that happened since the design, the initial design of the plant. So you might design your plant to produce 100 or 110 million ton and per year, and later on you find out that you have issues related to equipment and so on. So the result is the available capacity is lower than 10 million ton per year. And that is the available capacity in the in the yellow bars. As you can see, most of 2012 up to 2014, I think this one is for ethylene plants. The ethylene plants are almost 100% effective, meaning the operating rate is at its maximum or near its maximum. Cost structure. When you work in a plant, it's very important to know the cost structure of your product. Cost structure is a high-level model for cost categories. ببساطة معرفة تفاصيل التكاليف وهيكلتها في القطاع اللي تعمل فيه أنت. وكل قطاع يختلف عن الآخر لخصوصيته. فمثلا إذا جينا نتكلم على قطاع مثل قطاع الاستشارات الهندسية أو قطاع الديزاين كومبانيز engineering design companies. القطاع هذا قطاع لا يحتوي على كثير من الفيكست كوست. أغلب التكاليف المتعلقة بقطاع الكونسلتيشن أو الاستشارات هي تكاليف ليست متعلقة بالأصول. لا يوجد أصول متعلقة عادة بهذا القطاع. في المقابل نشوف قطاع مثل قطاعات الصناعة، نجد أن كمية الأصول اللي موجودة كمية كبيرة. لكن في قسم الصناعة أو في قطاعات الصناعة كل قطاع يختلف عن الآخر. خلينا نشوف كيف هيكلة التكاليف في قطاع البتروكيميكال وخصوصا الأثيلين. هذا مثال الآن أمامك تقسيم أو هيكلة التكاليف في صناعة الأثيلين. لو تلاحظ في الشارت الموجود بالأسفل نلاحظ أن variable cost constitute a large proportion of the product cost or of the production cost. يعني out of almost $1,200 per ton of ethylene, you have almost $1,000 due to variable cost. But we go to the above graph and we see that the variable cost is primarily raw material and utility cost. And raw material is in fact the primary one. معناها, if you want to compete in producing ethylene, one important consideration is the cost of your feedstock. تكلفة اللقيم في البتروكيماويات مهمة جدا جدا. في سنة 2005 كنا في أرامكو السعودية، وأرامكو السعودية كانت تفكر في رفع أسعار اللقيم على سابق، وبدأ الكلام والنقاش في رفع أسعار اللقيم لسابق، وكثير من المحللين بكل وضوح وصراحة سواء في داخل السعودية أو في خارج السعودية قالوا بشكل واضح أنه رفع أسعار اللقيم على شركات البتروكيماويات راح يسبب بضعف شديد لهذا القطاع مقارنة بالشركات الخارجية، لأن السبب الرئيسي لجذب الشركات الأجنبية للدخول في هذا القطاع في المملكة العربية السعودية كان مبني على رخص أو الأسعار التنافسية الجيدة لللقيم، واللي هو ببساطة النافثة والإيثين. طبعا رفع بعدها بفترة رفعت أسعار اللقيم بس بشكل بسيط. طيب، إذا في أي سؤال يا شباب ممكن نأخذ كم سؤال الآن حتى فقط لا تتراكم علينا الأسئلة. اللقيم أنا أشاهد في أحد الرسائل يسأل عن اللقيم. اللقيم هو الفيدستوك or the raw material. لاحظ في الشارت اللي في الأسفل اختلاف أسعار أو توزيع الكوست ستراكشر باعتبار المنطقة. فمثلا في أوروبا تجد أن سعر اللقيم عالي، في أمريكا تجد أن سعر اللقيم منخفض، وأيضا في منطقة الشرق الأوسط سعر اللقيم أيضا منخفض. لذلك في منطقة مثل منطقة السعودية ومنطقة الخليج لا نستطيع أن نقول أن سعر اللقيم هو الأهم عندنا. ليش؟ لأن زي ما أنت شايف هنا بحسب الجراف اللي موجود أمامك سعر اللقيم أو سعر الرو ماتيريال يمثل تقريبا نصف تكلفة الإنتاج. أما النصف الآخر فهو متعلق بتكاليف أخرى واللي هي السالاريز اللي هي الرواتب، التاكسز اند انشورنس التأمين، وأيضا الانترست اللي هي فوائد رأس المال، والإهلاك الديبريشيشن، وأمور أخرى راح نتكلم عليها لاحقا. أما إذا كنت راح تبني مصنعك راح تبنيه في أوروبا فبالتأكيد راح تحاول الاستفادة من اللقيم وزيادة الefficiency of the raw material and finding a competitive source of material as much as possible. Okay. All right. So let's so this is, we talked about variable cost. Now let's talk about capital cost. For those who doesn't know the difference between the two, fixed cost and variable cost. What do we mean by fixed cost and variable cost? Variable cost are things that you pay on annual basis to operate your plant. This is your variable cost. Fixed cost are costs that either are related to building your plant, or things that are fixed on annual basis but are not a function of the level of operation. بمعنى آخر، إذا تبغى تفرق بين الفيكس كوست والفاريبل كوست عندك one criteria. سؤال واحد تسأله نفسك تستطيع أن تجد الإجابة. If I shut down my plant and I go to zero production, how the cost that I still have to pay are considered fixed cost. Anything that goes to zero will be a variable cost. ناخذ مثال. If you shut down your plant completely, you still have to pay salaries. If you shut down your plant, if you go to zero level operation, you still have to pay your you still have to pay your interest on the equipment and the capital that you bought. This is a very simplistic, maybe oversimplifying criteria, but it's very powerful if you want to try it to distinguish between the two types. Part of fixed cost is capital cost that you have to pay at the initial stage of building your plant, and that type of fixed expenditures are called capital expenditure, or in short, CapEx. In economics, we typically hear two important terms: amortization and depreciation. What is amortization? Amortization is the act of spreading out capital expenses over a time period or the lifetime of your capital. So if I purchase a car and the lifetime of the car is 10 years, then I will take the cost of the car and spread it out across the 10 years. Assuming that there is no interest, or there's zero interest on the car, I will basically take the cost of the car divided by 10 and spread the cost over 10 years. And that is basically the concept of amortization. We don't want to deal with an expense that happens at the beginning of the project without taking that cost and spreading that cost across the life of my plant. The only distinction between amortization and depreciation is the fact that amortization is used for intangible assets. Typically, depreciation is used for tangible assets. Tangible معناها محسوسة. Okay. Intangible معناها غير محسوسة. For example, IP is intellectual property, is called an intangible asset, while equipments are an example of tangible assets. So amortization and depreciation somehow are the same term applied to different type of assets in your plant. There is another difference between amortization and depreciation that you will learn later when you take advanced courses or you take your economic course. Basically, amortization uses a straight line depreciation method, while in depreciation, we can use different methods for depreciation. And a third difference is amortization has zero salvage value compared to depreciation, where you can have some salvage value. Salvage value is the value of your equipment at the end of its life after you retire that equipment. If we take the example of the car, at the end of the 10 years, you will have exhausted the life of the car, and but you still have to take, you still can take the car and sell it, or maybe take it and sell it as parts, as salvage, equipment. Okay, so this is what I wanted to cover in amortization. We move to profit margin. Profit margin is one of the actually confusing concepts in economics, not because it is very difficult to understand, rather because profit margin is typically has different meanings depending on the context. So you have to pay attention when you hear the term profit margin. What do they really mean by profit margin? In the context of petrochemicals, rather than using profit margin, they use the term crack spread. And crack spread is the difference between 3 barrels of crude oil and 2 barrels of Gulf Coast gasoline, plus the difference between 3 barrels of crude oil and 2 barrels of Gulf Coast gasoline, plus 1 barrel of Gulf Coast ultra low sulfur diesel. So the difference between 3 barrels of crude oil and, on the other hand, 2 barrels of Gulf Coast gasoline plus 1 barrel of Gulf Coast ultra low sulfur diesel. Why do we take this difference? Because this difference gives me an important indication of how much is the difference between my feedstock, which is crude oil, and my intermediates, which is gasoline and diesel. This is more into refining. However, as we are seeing more integrated petrochemical industry, also this is becoming an interesting index for petrochemicals. So as you can see in this graph, this is not steady. It keeps changing depending on the cost of crude oil and gasoline and diesel price. Working capital is another term that is very important to understand if you want to look at economics or the economics of your plant. Working capital has a very lengthy definition in economics and in accounting. However, you can look at it as current assets minus current liabilities. At any point of time, how much assets you have minus how much liabilities you have, this is called working capital. And it's typically simplified by taking how much cash you have plus how much amount you owe, how much others owe you, which is called account receivables, plus how much is your inventory, minus account payable, which is basically how much you owe others. Working capital is very important in the petrochemical industry, and we will see how. But before I move into why it is important to the petrochemical industry, I want to explain working capital a little bit more to make sure that you really understand the concept. Working capital is basically when you start any project, you have to start with some kind of capital. Okay. The capital that you start with to run your plants and to operate your plants from the day you finish building the plant, you have to have some cash for it to work, okay, and generate more money. For example, if you build a plant and you want to start running the plant, you need to buy some feedstock. You need to buy some chemicals. You need to hire people. For all of that, you need working capital. This is what we mean by working capital. بالعربي يسمونه رأس المال العامل. رأس المال العامل. وببساطة في حاجة أخرى يسمونها دورة رأس المال العامل. ومعنى دورة رأس المال العامل هي قدرتك في استثمار رأس المال بشكل سريع حتى يأخذ دورة كاملة. مثلا إذا ابتدأت ب100,000 ريال واستطعت في خلال وتشغل هذه 100,000 ريال واستطعت في خلال سنة في مضاعفتها فأصبحت 200,000 ريال، إذن دورة رأس المال العامل تحصلت على رأس المال العامل خلال سنة، فهذه دورة رأس المال العامل. طيب working capital in the petrochemical industry is very, very important. Why? Because working capital is very large in petrochemical industry. Remember, we said the feedstock represent a big portion of your production cost. That is the reason you will have to pay a lot of working capital, and you have to captivate a lot of the working capital into your feedstock. ناخذ مثال. لو عندك naphtha cracker, if you have a naphtha cracker, a cracker is basically an equipment that takes naphtha and decompose it into more useful chemicals. Okay, cracking meaning cutting it into more useful chemicals. A naphtha cracker consumes around 3 billion of feedstock for every 1 million ton of production. So you tie $3 million of feedstock for every 1 million ton. And it will take time for this 3 billion, for this $3 billion to be cashed out. So that's why working capital is important. طبعا there are advanced working capital management strategies that I will not talk about. Basically, these strategies looks at how we can improve our position in terms of working capital management, and how we can utilize, either minimize or maximize working capital depending on our business. All right. I need another 6 minutes to finish. So supply demand curves. This is one of the basic concepts in economics. شوف بس إذا في رسائل. Isn't that considered to be a loss, 3 billion? No, it's not considered a loss. It's not considered a loss for one reason. This $3 billion is not lost. This $3 billion is tied to your process. Eventually, that $3 billion will be retrieved. However, the problem comes because when you have high interest rate on your working capital. يعني المشكلة مش فقط في $3 billion. $3 billion راح تاخذها. You will recover that $3 billion later down the road. But the problem is, if the interest rate, إذا قيمة الفوائد البنكية is high عالية, then this $3 billion will cost you millions of dollars before you get it back. And this is the challenge when, by the way, in my previous slide, I was not referring to $1 million. It's 1 million ton. It's 1 million ton rather than $1 million. So we're not comparing 3 billion to $1 million. We're comparing 3 billion for each 1 million ton. So demand and supply curves is a very basic concept in microeconomics that every engineer, in my opinion, has to know. Let me digress a little bit and tell you that economics is segregated into two fields, microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics deals with the economics of products, companies, markets, while macroeconomics deals with international monetary markets, which is basically exports, imports, fiscal policy. All of these is part of macroeconomics. The supply and demand is covered under microeconomics. طيب. All right, I will do إن شاء الله. ما الدافع لسابق أنها فتحت مصانع في أوروبا وما تعتبر تكاليفها أعلى في الشرق الأوسط؟ راح نتكلم عن هذا الشيء إن شاء الله لاحقا. طيب. supply and demand معناها العرض والطلب. معناها العرض والطلب. أنا راح أحاول أتكلم عربي وإنجليزي لأنه I think we might have some English speaking audience. Supply means العرض والdemand معناها الطلب. I have to annotate here. So let's see if I can annotate. Yeah, good. Okay. So a supply is the curve that indicates the relationship between price and quantity supplied. So this curve here, for example, is a supply curve. This is supply curve. If we look at supply curve, it's typically has a positive slope, and it indicates that whenever you have the price, whenever you have a price increase, your quantity supplied will increase. I would like to make a distinction between the word supply and the word quantity supplied. And you will see why I would like to make this distinction as we go along. So the supply curve is a very intuitive curve. يعني معناها أن this supply curve منطقي جدا، لأن كلما ازداد سعر المنتج كلما زادت كمية العرض من مقدم المنتج. If we talk about ethylene, we increase the price of ethylene, we expect the supplier to provide more quantity to the market. This is the supply curve. The demand curve is a negatively sloped curve because when the price of any commodity increases, the quantity demanded decreases. The price هنا price هنا مثلا كان تقريبا $10. It increased to $100. What do we expect? We expect the quantity demanded 1 to go down from this level to quantity demanded 2, which is a lower quantity demanded. Now, there's an intersection between supply and demand, and that point is called price equilibrium. And if you are in a competitive market and with other assumptions, you will always end up at this point, regardless of any regardless of what is your starting point. So let's say you are starting at this point here. Let's say you are a supplier. You are one supplier of ethylene, and the price you provide is $10 for each kilogram of $10 for each kilogram of ethylene. Well, your supply at that level is much lower than the demand. So what will happen? You have a shortage here. You will start increasing the supply. As you increase the supply, you would also notice that the demand also decreases. Eventually, you will end up at the equilibrium, at the price equilibrium. There are few things that sometimes causes a shift in the supply and demand curve. Yani this demand and supply curve is not always fixed. It could shift up or down depending on many factors. Let's take an example of the supply shift. If you have a substitution, an alternative to your product, if you have an alternative to your product, if you have a new alternative to your product, then what will happen to the demand curve? Well, the demand curve for your product, let's call it product A, and this alternative product is product B. The supply curve will now shift to the right, sorry, to the left. The supply curve will shift to the left. No, sorry, I meant the demand curve. I meant the demand curve. We're talking about demand now, because what will happen if you have alternatives? Customers will leave product A and go and shop product B. So the demand will shift to the left. Now we have a new equilibrium price. That equilibrium price is the new equilibrium price. We have many things that could shift the demand or supply curve. In the field of petrochemicals, we have, so the perfect price quantity point is on the intersection. Yes, it's not only perfect, it's the equilibrium. Eventually the price has to come to this point. Okay, so there are a few things that can cause the demand to shift. For example, GDP. What do we mean by GDP? Gross domestic product. gross domestic product is an indication of the how strong is the economy. قوة الاقتصاد. أحد أهم مقاييس قوة الاقتصاد هو ال GDP. Okay, gross domestic product. Now, if we have higher gross domestic product, it means that we have better economy, healthy economy. So demand will shift up or shift to the right. Population growth is another also important demand shifter. Population growth will shift your curve also to the right. The more people you have, the more demand you have. Like on the supply side, if you have new entries to your market, if you have new plants in your market, the supply also will increase. You will have a shift of the demand curve also to the right. Like the term rationalization is basically a very fancy name for revisiting economics of your plant and closure. Meaning, rationalization, it's a process of looking at your existing plants and deciding how you can improve it, and if necessary, close it down, shut it down. And if rationalization happens, then what will happen, depending on your action, if you decide to close that plant down, then your supply will shrink and it will shift to the left. Right. This, if I'm not mistaken, this is my last slide. I would take it as my last slide. So to summarize, I have bombarded you with many economic terms. These economic terms are very simple in its fundamental meaning. However, I wanted to show you, as I link them to an existing market, how complicated sometimes it is to apply such concepts. For example, the concepts of demand and supply is very useful. However, this demand and supply keeps changing by the moment. That's why in analyzing the petrochemical industry, we don't talk about supply and demand curves. If you go and search for supply and demand curve for ethylene or polyester, you will not be able to find a supply and demand curve. What you will find is actually studies on the demand and supply dynamics, because it keeps changing. So it's very important to understand how they change rather than just fixing it to a specific curve. I hope this was very helpful. You had many questions. I would be happy to entertain these questions. So it's up to you, Majid, whether you want it to be always in the form of written questions on the chat, or would you like it to be also voice questions?
هذا دكتور ما هو مشكلة، الشيء راجع لك. ونطلع بأي أحد عنده سؤال يقدر يرفع يده ويسأل. بس دكتور قبل ما ناخذ أسئلة، أنا أرسلت رابط تحضير وراح يكون مفتوح ل5 دقائق.
طيب خلينا نشوف الأسئلة. Let's entertain the questions that we have in the chat one by one. Why we usually process lower than the maximum capacity? Yes, it goes back to the supply and demand curve that I showed. So I don't know, Abdurrahman, if your question is before seeing the supply and demand curve or after. But if you look at the demand curve, demand and supply, the equilibrium price is the price that that dictates how much quantity you want to produce. If you decide to produce more quantity, then you will have more surplus in the market, and the price of your commodity will go down. طبعا, if the price goes down, you have a problem, of course, because your revenue is equal to price times quantity. So what you care about is not the price going up or down. What you care about is price times quantity. That's what you really care about. Next question is, or next comment by Dr. Robin. One reason to adjust for changing conditions in the economy may be a sudden increase in the demand. Yes, thank you, Dr. Robin. Next, to leave space in case of market upset, isn't that considered to be a loss? طب we entertain that. السؤال اللي بعده، ما الدافع لسابك أنها فتحت مصانع في أوروبا ما تعتبر تكاليفها أعلى من الشرق الأوسط؟ سؤال جميل. So to translate that question, he's asking why SABIC is opening some plants in Europe or buying some plants in Europe. The answer to this question is actually related to the fact that SABIC wants to be an important player in the petrochemical industry. It wants to maintain a specific or a threshold for market share. That's number one. تريد الاستحواذ على حصة من السوق جيدة. وإذا استحوذت على حصة جيدة من السوق راح تكون لاعب مهم في السوق، وبذلك تستطيع أن يعني يكون لها دور كبير في إدارة سوق البتروكيميكال. هذا أول شيء. الأمر الآخر, the second thing is something related to supply chain. When you have your market, your end users are in Europe, in China, in emerging markets, so it's very important that you have plants or you have ways to these markets. You have access to these markets. So this might be the reason why SABIC is keen about having some plants in Europe and emerging countries. Next question is, طيب, we answered all the questions. If you have additional questions, please raise your hand. And Ahmed Salam, تفضل.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. I have a question. So what do you think about the future of petrochemicals for the environmental use?
Okay, this is a very good question. He's asking, what's the future of petrochemicals, bearing in mind that environmental concerns is mounting. I think petrochemical industry will continue with a good future. The challenge, the environmental challenge will be overcome through many ways. Number one, you could reduce your environmental emissions by emerging technologies. You can now, for example, I know many petrochemicals is improving their focusing in the methodologies of the final products. They're also looking at how catalysis can improve in reducing emissions. Another also important things to reduce your emissions is to look at the feedstock. So your feedstock, as we move from crude oil feedstock to gas, to more greener feedstock. For example, you have hydrogen feedstock. There's a green hydrogen, biomass. All of these could be feedstocks to the petrochemicals. So the petrochemicals will not be. I think they will still be there, even if the transportation and the fuel industry changes. The petrochemical will still be there. What about storage cost؟ أو قبل كذا، هل تكاليف الشحن والضرائب على مصانع البتروكيماويات في الشرق الأوسط أعلى من غيرها؟ I don't really know. But roughly speaking, we are well positioned in closer to emerging markets. We're not far away from India. We are close to Europe. Also, China is not really far away, compared, of course, relatively compared to America. So I think we are well positioned in terms of transportation. In terms of taxes, I think we're lower. I don't have any information about that. What about storage cost? Is it considered a big factor? Storage cost, as you've seen in the structure, we do have a lot of working capital, but it's not really maintaining inventory. So we don't store a lot of products and a lot of feedstock. But the working capital is actually due to processing and the cycle, the working capital cycle within the ethylene production. في واحد رافع يده، تفضل.
Yes, Doctor. Thank you for this very insightful seminar. I have a couple of questions, actually. The first is, how can petrochemical companies survive the economic downturn that we face these 2 years from a cost optimization point of view? And the second one, what competitive advantages does the local companies of petrochemicals have over the global companies?
Very good questions. So for the first question, how can they survive the downturn? Now, generally speaking, when we talk about commodity petrochemicals, not specialty or fine petrochemicals, economies of scale plays an important role. So the larger you are, with a well-designed plant, makes you survive these downturns. I do have a chart, actually, but I don't have it handy, of what happened in 2008 in the petrochemical industry. Most of the petrochemical firms that went out of the business in 2008 were small petrochemical players. So SABIC, GE, not GE, yes, GE and important players will not have a problem in such downturn time. However, they have to be very innovative in the production cost. This is exactly what's happening when they integrate between plants, such as what they do in Sadara now. And they also need to increase their value chain. This is another strategy they can do to improve their economies, is to go and increase their value chain. In Sadara, for example, they have what they call Blaskem Park next to Sadara, and the whole purpose of the Blaskem Park is to actually have some kind of a synergy between Sadara and other collaborative companies to produce more added value products. This is to answer your first question. Your second question is, remind me of your second question, please.
Was about what competitive advantages does the Saudi companies have over global companies?
Well, this is actually the $1 million question, or maybe $1 billion question, that the government is trying to figure out a recipe to make it very attractive to petrochemical industries to operate here. And not only petrochemicals, other also firms and factories. But initially we started with lower feedstock. Now we are deregulating a lot of the industries and sectors, including waiving taxes and providing relaxed policies in terms of labor. هذه من الأمور الحساسة كثير لأي شركة تريد أن تأتي وتعمل مصانعها، تريد أن يكون عندها المرونة الكافية بحيث أنها إذا تحتاج يعني expertise from outside, they can still bring the expertise and they can bring labor from outside if necessary. And more importantly, we need to have the local labor market ready and competitive compared to the international market. If we don't achieve that, it will be very difficult for others to come and do business with us. Next question is, based on your expertise and work experience in Aramco, what will happen to the local petrochemical market if the natural gas prices linked to the global market? I don't think this will happen because this will actually الآن طبعا اللي حاصل الآن طبعا إنه سابق وأرامكو شركة واحدة. سابقا أرامكو is the same company now. So زي ما يقولون دهنا في مكبتنا. ف I don't think Aramco will do that just because it will impact other industries other than petrochemicals. Which is very essential for major projects to materialize. احنا عندنا مشاريع كثيرة في السعودية we still are waiting for, including Jubail 2, many industrial cities to be developed in Jizan, in Ras Al Khair, etc. So we need to have a competitive advantage. So I think natural gas prices will still be competitive compared to global market. كيف يمكن لمصانع البتروكيماويات في أوروبا المنافسة في السوق العالمي مع هذا الفرق الهائل في أسعار اللقيم؟ Well, that's a good question. You know, if you go and look at the graph that I have presented, in America, the price is very close to the Middle East, but there is a big gap between America and Middle East on one hand, and Europe on another hand. But I think this could be offset by other things. Maybe taxation, for example. Yani enter your product, when it enters the European market, it gets taxed. So this taxation add cost to your product. So that's one thing to look at that could explain why European products are still in the market. Any other questions?
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عليكم السلام. بس في one last question here from an attendee. Where can we find additional materials related to capex of petrochemicals? That's a good question also. Because if you want to learn about economics in general, you will be able to find a plethora of material. You will find books, articles, magazines. But if you want to find specific information about an industry, it's a hard search. Whether it is capex, prices of price forecast, also design practices. These are very hard to find. I know two sources that sometimes offer free material, but most of their material is actually paid. For example, some of the material I presented today is from ICIS Consulting, and ICIS provides some consultation and workshops on petrochemicals and market forecast, as well as some consultation, as we said. Another source for also design and capex estimation is IHS Market. That's another company called IHS Market. It provides some preliminary designs of systems, and also some estimation of the cost and market forecast. Do you think US-China trade war could affect the petrochemicals industries in the Arabian Gulf? I don't think so, because China trade war with the US is focused on the products that could hurt the export and import between these two countries. So, and primarily not petrochemicals. There are things that are related to other final products and intermediate products that are not in the petrochemical industry, at least to my knowledge. Do you agree that the solution to make our companies competitive is to create new innovative products? I think SABIC, it's in a position that has little interest to move into downstream products. And but however, they would be interested to help other medium companies to come and build downstream products and more innovative products. The reason is the way big companies are structured. They are structured toward commodity products, and it becomes very hard to change their business model to produce innovative product or more downstream and products. So That's one thing to bear in mind. However, the term innovative product is very generic. When we say innovative products, of course, companies are interested to innovate products. But SABIC, for example, is in the business of commodity products. And commodity products, usually we focus on innovation in the production rather than innovation in the products. So this is one of the challenges SABIC will have, or big players will have. But it is very important to be innovative, and it is also very challenging. I believe it is more efficient, it's cost efficiency or cost effectiveness, not as much as innovation. Okay, that goes along with our answer. Any other question?
دكتور حابب تقول شيء قبل ما نختم؟
عندي question.
Okay.
Okay, Doctor, I have a question about the source we use right now, petrol. Will we use combined energy in the future? For example, we use petrol with the solar power.
Okay, good question. Renewable energies in general are a source of energy. So you take renewables and you use it for power generation, you use it for transportation. And this is the primary use for renewable energy, be it solar or wind power. However, before we move into petrochemicals, this is exactly the reason why Aramco is investing into petrochemicals. Because Aramco thinks that the future of oil and gas is into chemical conversion. This should be a bad news and a good news at the same time for chemical engineers. It's good news because chemical conversion is in the heart of chemical engineering. So instead of working as a chemical engineer, instead of working in a power plant, in few years or in 10 years, 20 years, you will be working primarily into a chemical conversion plant that convert oil and gas into final products. So Aramco wants to invest into the petrochemicals because it's the future of oil and gas. Now, this is the trend so far. However, there is a way to convert renewable energy into petrochemicals. You take renewable energy and feed it into from renewable energy, you can feed it into a hydrogen, into a fuel cell. You create hydrogen, okay? And you take that hydrogen and create petrochemicals. However, to me, I think still that route is a little bit lengthy. And in the near future, renewables are going to stick into the energy sector, while the oil and gas will divert toward products.
To depend second, if I have to use two energies in the same times. For example, if we think that if you use solar or wind with petrochemical, for example, to improve the environment, to reduce the gases, or to reduce the gas emissions that came, can we do this? Because we want a solution to...
The short answer is yes.
our environment. If we have a
Correct.
solution.
Correct. Of course, you can do that. It all goes down to the economics. Does it make sense economically that you have 2 systems or 3 systems? Sometimes, yes. If you do a proper design and integration between your systems, you can end up with a very attractive design and a very attractive financial result. So you would end up with a hybrid, let's call it a hybrid system. And in fact, we see that actually in cars. Some of the cars are called hybrid cars. They operate with gas, and at the same time, they operate with other type of fuel, either be it hydrogen. BMW created a hybrid car that have a hybrid car at the same time, gasoline driven. So yes, the answer is yes.
يعطيك العافية دكتور. حابب تقول شيء بس قبل ما نختم؟
أود أشكر الجميع على التفاعل، وإن شاء الله أتمنى أني أفدتكم ويعطيكم العافية.
وتشرفنا صراحة.